This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 18th, 1906, the Great San Francisco Earthquake, about a 7.9 on the Richter scale. The quake lasted some 50 seconds, almost a minute, and in the end, it devastated San Francisco, leaving more than 3,000 people dead and destroying more than 28,000 buildings. That is, get this, more than 80% of the structures in the city at that time. The quake ruptured the San Andreas Fault to the north and south of the city, a total of 296 miles, and could be felt all the way up to Oregon, all the way down to Los Angeles, and inland, all the way to central Nevada. Its impact has been well covered. Obviously, the city was devastated. Seismology learned a ton from the event. We're a political history show, so maybe we'll focus a little bit on that part of the fallout. But luckily, every big story has big political fallout. So, plenty to discuss here. As always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I suppose this is a little glimpse into how far in advance we record these episodes, but we happen to be recording today on the day that there was a small little earthquake. Maybe not that small, maybe not that little earthquake here in New York City. Everyone is talking about it, but just a few hours ago on the day we were recording, I didn't feel it. I was walking home. I was on the sidewalk. Really? I didn't feel it at all. And then I saw neighbors come out onto the street and they were like, whoa, that was a big one. That was a big one. And then I get home and my wife was like, did you feel that? And, and then text messages, Twitter's going crazy. I turn on WNYC, the Brian Lehrer show's interrupting. I somehow did not feel it at all. But I was just walking down the street, I guess. But, it was a 4.8, I think is what they're saying. So that's not 4.8. That's not nothing.
Yeah. Yes, it might not be the most devastating earthquake that ever happened, but I have found, and I've been through all different sorts of natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, those kinds of things, but the earth moving under your feet, the thing that is the metaphor for solidity and literal groundedness is unsettling in a way that nothing else I've ever experienced is. And you can just imagine for the folks who in 1906 are living through this 7.9 magnitude quake, and that goes on for nearly a minute, even without thinking about all the devastation that came after it, just how world-ending that must have felt when they were going through it.
Oh, no question. I think about the length of that. It's one thing to get a little rattle. It's another thing for 1 minute is a really long time, actually, when you sort of just track it out and sit with it. That's a long time to be shaken up. And I think also during a time in which, what's so unsettling about an earthquake is it's like, what do I grasp for? And so I can imagine even back then, those feelings were even more terrifying.
Especially if you sort of take it in this larger context of the era and San Francisco, and specifically, we have a city that is exploded over a number of years because of the gold rush. It is a modern city. It is embracing new technology, new modernity. It has, big buildings. It has telephone systems, telegraph systems, gas lines. And in some way there is this sense of reason and industry has conquered the natural disorder of things. And then this hits and I think reminds people, that sort of chaos is just there at any moment. And, ironically enough, it's a lot of those natural gas lines that then explode and lead to fires. And it is the fires that is the most devastating thing. And that's really where so many of the homes are lost. They don't collapse. They burn in the wake of this.
Right, but they can't tap into the water lines because the water lines have been broken. And so the fires just rage out of control. And so it's kind of disaster on top of disaster in a way that leaves 250,000 people without a place to live in a city of 400,000. So you're talking about more than half the population. There's no infrastructure for people. The telephone system, to the extent that it existed, was destroyed. Telegraph and telegram offices were destroyed. And so there's also no way to reach out in a way that's also just like compounds the sense of devastation.
Yeah, I can't imagine 80% of a city being destroyed. 3,000 people that they can account for, more than 3,000 people that die as a result of this. I mean, it is, and it's not just devastation, certainly in the moment, but this devastation, the fires go on for, you know, a pretty significant amount of time before they're able to put all of them out. And so you're spending weeks, months, still sort of like in a state of shock, homelessness. I mean, when you think about the amount of people, that over 250,000 people are homeless, and amidst the rubble and the ash, trying to carve out new spaces for themselves, it's not great for a long time.
Yeah. I want to talk about the recovery effort and the kind of way it shifted a lot of the politics and civics of the time. But our conversation right now is reminding me so much of that episode we did on the Johnstown flood, which was really fascinating. And the image that sticks to me there is not just of these floods roiling through this canyon and sort of wiping out all these towns, but then all of the houses that had been swept away piling up on each other, and then that catching on fire. And for days, this fire burning, and a lot of people dying in that. And so, you know, I mean, we look at disasters all around the world. We look at, you know, Katrina. It's like it's in the wake of it. It's in the days after that the real disaster sets in. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Obviously, we have this homelessness crisis immediately. There's basically refugee camps organized by the army, and martial law is imposed. But, you know, there are no surprise. There's fears of looting, and there's language about trying to shoot looters right on site. And so I'd be curious to know if that word even was being used back then and how politicized it was. But, you know, so many of the things we're used to seeing were present then as well. Hey there, Jody here, and I'm excited to tell you that one of our favorite Radiotopia siblings, Ear Hustle, is back with a brand new season. This is their 13th season, and the show just keeps getting better. Now, I don't know if you know, but Ear Hustle is the show about life inside prison, but it is not your typical prison podcast. Co-hosts Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods have recently been spending time at 4 California prisons, and now they have a season's worth of funny, surprising, and unforgettable stories to share. In a recent episode, they were able to visit a groundbreaking prison hospice where they spoke to men who are grappling with the reality of dying inside prison. Also coming up this season are stories about the objects people keep inside their prison cells, complicated mom-daughter relationships inside prison, and stories of incarcerated people who wonder whether they've become too comfortable behind bars. These are stories about life on the inside told by those who live it. I'll be listening, and I hope you will too. Find Ear Hustle wherever you get your podcasts.
And there's another bad guy that we have to point out here before we get to the solutions. And because you had all of this housing stock wiped out, landlords are like, oh, we have an even more precious commodity. And they start just like jacking up rents. Of course, there are basically no tenant protections at this point in time. And so this is also displacing even more people. And I think that tension is important to keep in mind because it reflects a lot of the dynamics around housing that we still talk about today. But what's different in this period is you have progressive reformers who see this as a moment to intervene in not just a disaster, but in a market that's now being exploited by landlords to say, okay, we need to get these people housing. And we're going to maybe build some affordable housing, which I think that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the housing is at least sort of like these cottages, these like wooden cottages that are made to be like makeshift homes. I mean, they're not really homes. They're about like 10 feet by 14 feet. And they spread and sort of proliferate all over the city. There's about maybe 5,000 of these small wooden cottages, but they're not sustainable. It's not long-term solutions to housing. You get a lot of what becomes sort of like tent cities or like squattervilles when you think about like the massiveness of or the massive amounts of homelessness. There's not appropriate shelter really for anyone.
But these cottages, I think, are a window into the way out of this crisis. They're not enormous. This is not a time of enormous housing, but even in the standards of the era, they're quite small. But they're built by union carpenters. They're solid structures. And in fact, as the crisis begins to ease, the cottages are relocated to places throughout the city. It allows for the refugees to sort of transition back into city life by embedding them in the city. But they also created a rent-to-own system where working class refugees could pay $2 a month, and over the course of time, they would come to own that property. And so suddenly you have lower income San Franciscans who are able to become homeowners in the city. And that, I think, is the progressive era thing, like good progressive era, not bad progressive. They all go hand in hand. But that idea that like you were using this moment to help create a vision of a different kind of society than what existed before, one that would help create opportunities for people who don't normally have opportunities in the city.
But then, of course, the bad side of progressivism rears its head, which is basically
as it always
within
does.
a couple years, mostly upper class San Franciscans start to look at these cottages and start to say these should be taken down. We should be evicting people from these. And, they hide behind it being a health risk, which maybe it was. I mean, these were not the most...
No question there's a health risk.
Yeah. But, it's so funny that this is kind of seen, and you read about this, and it is really the same dynamic that has played out, especially in a place like San Francisco, over and over and over. It's seen as the classic, as maybe like the birth of classic San Francisco NIMBYism and this sort of fight over real estate, especially in a city that is just really constricted territorially, right? It's just only so big. And so it is funny that these cottages, even in 1907, the fight over these cottages just reflects all of these strains that we see out there today about we need to build more low-income, small, affordable, easily manufactured housing for all, and then other people saying, well, this is degrading the value of this finite real estate and we should kick these folks out, and all that stuff. All those dynamics were there.
Even sort of like
years.
Somehow I find a way, or we find a way to always talk about rats, but I think about like the rats that they had to build these wooden houses up on stilts to keep the rats out. Like when I think about natural disasters, I'm always like, the rats are coming next. Like the rats are coming. Whenever there's sort of like these places in which you think about the public health crisis, like sewage, sanitation, access to clean water, all of those things, rats are a part of the deal. And it just it makes places like this unlivable too.
Well, and these rats happen to be carrying bubonic plague, which is not ideal in this situation, I would say. You see a return of the rat bounties. Remember we talked about this, where you could bring in a rat tail and get a buck. That system comes into play in San Francisco. But much more tragically, in order to combat this quote-unquote public health crisis, these cottages, many of them are burned to the ground with all of the belongings inside, ostensibly to wipe out this health risk. But imagine having lost everything in an earthquake and fires, and then have the government come in and burn down your house. It's like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I know. Catch a break.
Speaking of the bad side of progressive politics.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a lot of what this meant for infrastructure and housing policy, and obviously the city rebuilds. I think largely speaking, it rebuilds pretty fast and doesn't really necessarily learn too many lessons. I mean, there's some talk about how to do what about the next earthquake, but it's that 1989 earthquake, much later. But that 1989 earthquake, that's when the housing code really gets reworked. And I mean, a lot of stuff changes, but not that much changes in terms of just kind of building codes and making the city safe, in part because the city is so keen on keeping its place as the sort of home of the gold rush. It's in competition with Los Angeles. It wants to just basically get back in the mix as quickly as possible and make people feel like this is the place to bring your industry and your wealth and so forth.
And city boosters didn't want people to think there were going to be more earthquakes.
Yeah.
So they're like, we can't build earthquake-proof buildings because then people will think earthquakes will happen.
That's letting the earthquakes win.
That's right.
So let's turn a little bit from infrastructure to people. So one really interesting thing is how this reshaped the demographics of the city, including one really, really fascinating tidbit, which is, so Chinatown has long been a deep Chinese population in San Francisco. Chinatown is basically destroyed and devastated by fire in the wake of this and has to rebuild. But one silver lining, I suppose, is that the fire did destroy all the immigration records in the city. And for decades after and generations after, Chinese residents began claiming citizenship and allowing them to then bring family members to the United States because there was no real way, because all the records had been destroyed. I mean, it's a really, really fascinating fallout.
Get in where you fit in. That's right. The timing is right. Like, I'm not mad at that either.
No, not at all. It's this whole generation that was known as paper sons, which we should also do an episode on, but like coming to the U.S. Because they had family members in the U.S. and those family members, remember, like couldn't be considered citizens if they immigrated to the U.S. because Chinese people weren't allowed to be citizens unless they were born in the U.S. and then they were natural born citizens. And that's why the destruction of the immigration records were so important, because then people who had immigrated could say, well, I was born here. I'm a citizen.
And there you go. So final note here, I will say in terms of kind of larger response and lessons, and it largely speaking, the federal response was seen as pretty proactive. And, you know, we talked about how the U.S. Army came in and set up these camps and housing was built, so forth. And I think it did kind of serve as a model in many ways. I mean, even as recently as, you know, Katrina, people were pointing out like, oh, in the wake of the 1906 earthquake, you know, the federal government had a big role in disaster response. And so I think it did set a template in many ways in that sense. All right, let's leave it there. We'll move on from the very small earthquake in 2024 here in New York and the very big earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. But let's do a few also on this day's other things that happened April 18th throughout history. So 1775, this is when Paul Revere began his ride from Charlestown to Lexington and warning colonists that British troops were approaching. I like Paul Revere's ride, but after doing an episode on it, I have a much softer spot for that midnight ride of, well, what was her name? Sybil?
Yes.
Ludington? Ludington?
Yes.
Like that? There you go.
Yes.
Love her. Love her and her ride.
Yes, that was fantastic. And more than 200 years later, in 1978, on this day, the Senate approved the Panama Canal Treaty, providing for the complete turnover of control of the waterway to Panama on the very last day of 1999.
And in 1983, 63 people, including 17 Americans, were killed at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, by a suicide bomber.
We have not done that episode, but we should. Something around there. And then in 2019, this was the day in April, mid-spring, the final report from Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation was made public. And that cleared everything up about Russia's involvement in the...
Everyone was held accountable.
Everyone was on the same
page.
No
more controversy, I think, was pretty
nice
cool.
Nice little bow on it.
All right. We will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.